40 years ago, when China set out to open and reform its economy, there was an expectation on the part of the international community that China will be a responsible power once it becomes stronger. 20 years ago, in 2001, the Western world and the international community allowed China to become a member of the World Trade Organization. The motive behind allowing China to join the World Trade Organization was that once China joins the international liberal order, China's domestic economy would become more like Western world. And by doing so, China would also converge with a more liberal political system, if it's not a democratic system. And also, back then, there was an expectation that China would probably aspire to become a regional hegemon first, before it aspires to become a global hegemon. In other words, China would be a rather modest power without really trying to exercise its power and influence toward the neighboring countries as well as the international community. However, after 40 years since the reform began, at this point, China is not really up to that expectation. I think that particular perspective that I have just described is subject to intense debates and close scrutiny, particularly since 2012, after President Xi Jinping took power. I think China has become rather different from the China that we understood since 1980s. Let me say a few words about that change. First of all, I think the era of strategic modesty, and Chinese would call it Tao Guangyang Hui, is over. Strategic modesty, that is, even if China is powerful in its economic and military terms, China would not exercise its power at its discretion. However, since 2012 and 13 up to now, for the last 8-9 years, I think China has been much more at will in exercising its own power influence toward neighboring countries and other in the international community. And I think China's aspiration is summarized in the goal of the so-called China Dream, as well as the great revival of the Chinese nation. Second, China's foreign relations was espoused in 3 tenets, and these tenets were announced by eminent leader like Deng Xiaoping. The first one was 不当头, which is China would not assume global leadership. Second, 不称霸, China would not seek hegemony. Third, 不搞扩张, that is, China would not implement territorial expansion. However, the first of these 3, that is 不当头, China would not assume global leadership. This particular tenet has been missing since 2014. Maybe this has something to do with China's self-perception that China is a global leader, so it doesn't have to have that particular principle in its foreign relations. But this brings out one important question, that is to say, if China can abrogate the first principle of these 3, what about the second and third at some point in the future? What if China changes the second and seek hegemony? What if China abrogates the third tenet and implement territorial expansion? So this leaves quite a big question for us to digest. Third, China has announced the so-called the community with a shared future for mankind. This is a huge goal. Perhaps China wants people on earth to share and internalize Chinese values and norms, thereby leading to a international community which is led by China. I don't know. This concept is still rather abstract, but it is quite certain China has set out a goal that is for the mankind, not just for East Asia or Asia, but for the mankind. Fourth, China is number 2 in economic power at this point. Of course, in GDP terms, GDP is a very rough indicator for economic power, but nevertheless, it has a very significant symbolic power. And many people say in GDP terms, China may overtake the United States in 10 years. Once it takes place, I think it will have a significant impact on human perceptions of US-China relations. Second, the military dimension. China is currently number 3 in military dimensions, but it's catching up very fast with Russia and the United States. And in terms of simple tonnage, China's Navy has already overtaken Russia. And think about China's global reach. We used to think of China as a regional power, but China is already a global power. Think about the Belt and Road Initiative, which started out with a focus on Asia, but now it's extended to Europe, Africa, and Latin America. It actually covers the entire world. China's presence is felt almost everywhere in the world. If you go to Africa, if you go to Latin America, Middle East, China's presence is global. And China's influence is, of course, growing very rapidly. As I mentioned earlier, the Belt and Road Initiative, and New Development Bank, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and Confucius Institutes, and 24-hour English broadcasting system, CGTN, and so on and so forth. So China's reach, presence, influence is all global in nature. So in conclusion, China is a global power. But the question is China a global leader? And that question remains to be substantiated. In order for China to become a responsible great power, in my view, China has to overcome at least 5 different hurdles or obstacles in the coming years. First, of course, is the economic obstacle, which I would call a middle income trap. According to a World Bank estimates, 89 of 101 countries which had achieved a per capita income of $10,000 to $15,000 later failed to advance to high income status. 87 out of 101. That is a high percentage, which makes it very difficult for middle income countries to get into the area of or league of high income nations. China's per capita income is about 10,000. So it has already joined the middle income nations league. But will it be able to join the high income nations league in the future? There are too many variables. This is very important because if China cannot advance into a high income status, there will be a lot of social conflict. There will be a lot of social frustrations, which will constitute a political threat, and threat to the regime, and threat to Xi Jinping and the elite. So it will be a big problem for the Chinese leadership. But COVID-19 created enormous negative impact on economy. Whether or not China can manage that smoothly. Second, U.S. is putting pressure on China in the context of decoupling. And China is also implementing its own strategy of decoupling. So whether or not these will work out smoothly for China is another question. So we'll see. Without sustainable economic growth, China is not likely to become a responsible great power. So this is the first hurdle. Second hurdle is the concept called the two-city death trap, a vocabulary or concept which has become quite famous and popular thanks to Harvard professor Graham Allison. This is a concept in which a system-leading nation is likely to engage in a war of hegemonic transition with a rising challenger. Okay? Although, of course, this scenario is overly structural. It only focuses on national power without really thinking about mutual perceptions, agency, and leadership. But nevertheless, it offers a near-perfect metaphor for US-China relations of the 21st century. Now, the power gap between the United States and China is fast narrowing. And the mutual perception between Washington and Beijing is worsening very rapidly, particularly since 2017, thereby widening the window of opportunity for a war or military conflict. Will China be able to find a way out of this intricate dilemma? Because without really coming out of this trap, China will find it very difficult to utilize its opportunity to become a great power, not to speak of responsible great power. The third hurdle is what I would call the Kilderberger dilemma, or the public goods dilemma. Kilderberger is the name of a Princeton University professor, Charles Kilderberger, who suggested that the interwar period confusion and the Second World War were caused by Great Britain's inability to offer public goods, as well as the United States' unpreparedness and unwillingness to shoulder international responsibilities. So if we use that metaphor for 21st century, the United States is relatively declining at this point, while China is fast catching up. So US is much less prepared to take responsibility now, but China is unprepared and unwilling to shoulder international responsibilities. So there is a little bit of a vacuum there. And that vacuum is the source of international confusion and possibly international conflict. So will China be able to offer, and will China be willing to offer public goods in terms of economic management, foreign currency management, as well as international security protection? Let's take an example. For the period of 2000 through 2014, China and the United States made a lot of foreign spendings. But how much of that foreign spending by US and China was actually in the area of ODA, overseas development assistance, rather than investment? In the case of China, it was only 22%, and the remaining 78% was actually in investment. But in the case of the US, 93% of US foreign spending was in ODA. So that means the United States was much more altruistic than China. Of course, now China has been implementing the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, which is designed to bring about some public goods for the less developed countries. But at the same time, it also has generated a lot of noise. Some people even dub it as a debt diplomacy. So whether or not China can really bring out some of its resources to offer genuine public goods for the less developed countries around the world, that will be the third obstacle that China has to overcome in order to become a responsible great power. The fourth hurdle is what I would call the Yan problem, Y-A-N. Yan as in Yan Xuetong of Tsinghua University. Yan Xuetong has suggested for several years that China must establish alliance relationships with many countries in the world. China, at this point, only has one ally, that is North Korea. Although what kind of ally it is remains to be scrutinized, but China since 1980s has been insistent on not having alliances or allies. We call that a no alliance policy. But if you look at history, empires had colonies around the world as outposts of overseas control. And in the post-imperial world, superpowers like the United States and Soviet Union maintained alliances and overseas bases. The United States currently boasts of 69 allies, and 54 of them are treaty allies. And the United States maintains more than 1,000 overseas bases. Okay? So, question is then, in order for China to become a responsible great power which can exercise constructive influence over the world, can it do it without alliance and overseas bases? Because US and USSR, they all had alliances, allies, and overseas bases. But can China do it without them? Okay. Now, there was a very significant change along the front of foreign overseas base because China in 2017 established its first overseas base in Djibouti, Africa. So they changed their position on overseas bases. Will China also change its position on alliances? It has not yet, but if their position on overseas space is any guide at all, it is very possible for China to change its policy on alliances as well. But that remains to be seen. The fifth and last hurdle is what I would call the Nye paradox. Nye as in Joseph Nye, who is famous for the concept of soft power. Soft power is the ability to appeal by way of affection and shared values without using military or economic sanctions. China has been making a lot of efforts to enhance its soft power, and we used to dub it as a charm offensive. And as I mentioned earlier, the CGTN, Confucius Institutes, and many other programs that are designed to help less developed countries were effective to a certain extent. But overall, I think China's soft power initiative made only limited success mainly because of China's use of what I would call a sharp power. China was not hesitant to use its economic influence whenever it was necessary. For instance, Korea, over that controversy, China applied economic sanctions, and it continues up until today. And the targets of China's sharp power vary from Britain, Norway, Canada, Taiwan, Vietnam, or even Palau. So China's efforts as soft power initiative has only had limited success. If we look at the less developed countries in Africa, Middle East, Central and Latin America, I think China's popularity is quite high. But if you look at how popular China is among the advanced and developed and democratic countries, the answer is no. China is not popular. Why? Because China's norms and values are not supported by democratic and advanced countries. Soft power is very crucial because it will be the last area of contest between the US and China once China's power, both in economic and military terms, becomes similar to that of the United States. But I think China will increasingly find it difficult to strike a balance between soft power on one hand and sharp power on the other. Besides, China has yet to come up with its own alternative values and norms. US has been espousing the human rights, democracy, free market, and so on and so forth for several decades now. But will China be able to come up with alternative norms that can supplicate or supplement these values? I think that remains to be seen. This is a very interesting question. Is democracy also a prerequisite for China to become a responsible great power? Well, so many people, so many scholars and pundits have suggested that it is necessary for us to have a democratic China. Well, certainly it would be nice to have a democratic China. But I think at the same time, thinking outside the box would be necessary. First of all, I would like to offer 4 points. First one is democracy is relatively a new and recent phenomenon if you look at the human history. It's probably less than 200 years of history in terms of genuine democracy. It was not so much an important factor for the making of the Roman Empire or Tang Dynasty or Mongol Empire. But judge it by the standards of their time, I think these empires were responsible great powers in their times. So it is not quite clear whether a great power must be a democratic system. Of course, I know this could be a controversial, but I think we need to have an empirical study about this particular question. Second, is democracy an absolute guarantor of responsible diplomacy? My answer is unclear. If we look at the United States, of course, the United States has been, the protector of democratic values and norms for many decades. But has American diplomacy been democratic all the time? Or has the United States applied the double standards on and off? I would rather say the answer must be on the latter. Okay? Sometimes democracy became a hypocritical pretext for supporting self-centered national interest. So while democracy is important and democratic values are very crucial, but democracy cannot be an absolute guarantor of responsible diplomacy. And that should be applicable to China as well. The third point that I want to make is about the recent symptoms of global democratic backsliding. Democracy has been receding in many corners of the world, including the United States. If we look at what happened in January this year in the Capitol Hill, democracy has been receding in many countries. Okay? So given that, how should we frame this democratic or global democratic backsliding in terms of great power dynamics and the responsible diplomacy? The linkage is not quite clear empirically. So I think this should be left for empirical analysis. Finally, and most importantly for Korea, for instance, as well as other neighboring countries in Asia, is democratic China necessarily a blessing? My point is that currently China is controlled and ruled by the Communist Party. And Communist Party has a propaganda department, and propaganda department regulates and controls all the media, public opinion, and interest groups. So they are under complete control by the Communist Party. But what if China becomes democratic? Who is going to control public opinions, media, and interest groups? Who is going to control and regulate nationalistic, populist, chauvinistic, and Han-nationalist sentiments? Is that going to be a blessing for neighboring countries? Particularly those countries which have territorial disputes with China? My answer is probably in the negative. So with these 4 points in mind, we need to think that democracy in the context of China needs to be assessed more critically. Right after the presidential election in the United States, there was the initial expectation that US-China relations would much improve under the new Biden administration, unlike that of Trump administration. However, after 7-8 months of the Biden administration, that has not yet happened. Quite the contrary is true. Biden administration already set out the goal of strategic competition in its relations with China, and the parameter has already been set as extreme competition. I think in this context, I can offer 3 points that is mainly the differences between Biden and Trump in their relations with China. First, Biden has been intensifying the pressure tactic and has broadened the area of pressuring China. During the Trump administration, it was mainly the trade and exchange rate. But under Biden, it has been extended to many other areas beyond the economy. It's a societal and military, technological, and many others. Okay? Second, the Biden administration has focused on America's own competitive capabilities. Trump didn't really do that. But now Biden administration is focusing very much on the goal of enhancing America's competitive capability vis-a-vis China, from manufacturing to education. Particularly, their focus on education is noteworthy. Third, unlike Trump, Biden has repeatedly emphasized that it is very necessary to establish a counter-coalition between the US and its allies, partners, and friends against China. And we have all seen during the summer the G7 Plus, which was held in Britain, and then NATO summit. And we are going to see a very big event in December, which is a summit for democracy. And all this series of meetings have one goal, that is how to collectively cope with increasing pressure and influence tactics by China. Of course, China is not backing down. If you actually look at the records of America's trade sanctions against China in the last 4 years, China has also been adopting similar counter tactics against the US. Okay? China has not been backing down. China is actually adopting the strategy of tit for tat and ego fighting. Because China and US both are great powers, and great powers have egos. And ego fighting is a very interesting characteristic of US-China relations. And if you read President Xi Jinping's July 1st speech, which is a centenary speech, because the Chinese Communist Party was set up in July 1st of 1921, you can see how determined China is, and the nature of China's warning against the United States. If the U.S. provokes China, the U.S. will pay enormous cost, which is bleeding in the head, literally, in his speech. Okay. So what is happening at this point is, unlike the initial expectation, U.S.-China relations are getting more intensely competitive, confrontational, lacking dimensions of cooperation. Some people say, U.S.-China relations used to have like 70-30, 70 competition, 30 cooperation. But at this point, I think it's more like 90-10, 90 confrontation, 10 cooperation, if any. Okay. A lot of people take the issue of a new Cold War or Cold War 2.0. Well, I think Cold War 1.0 is over, but U.S.-China relations are resembling Cold War 1.7 at this point. Values and norms have already become an area of contest between the two, just like the United States and Soviet Union competed for capitalism and communism. Okay, so I would say the era of warm war has begun. It's not cold, but it's not yet hot. Okay. The outcome of this for neighboring countries and for medium-sized countries would be a third-party coalition. That is to say, U.S. and China, because of the nuclear constraint, they will not fight with each other. But nevertheless, they are in a serious extreme competition. Therefore, they will come to countries in the region and ask the same question, that is, are you with us or against us? If you are not with us, we're going to sanction you. This is going to be a very serious dilemma for countries in the region as well as in other corners of the world.